Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final session in our Holistic Justice Salon series with myself, Ana Gelsi Velasco Sanchez, and my co-host, co-facilitator, Alicia T. Crosby.
Hello, all.
Hi, Alicia. We are
Hey.
going to have a shorter conversation that we have in the other sessions. And the reason for this is the final chance for those that are participating live to really have some good conversation with one another. And we want to honor the confidentiality and the privacy of that conversation by not recording it for you all to watch later. So we're going to run through a few things with you right now, have some good conversation between Alicia and myself, and then we're going to say our farewells. At the end of the video, we'll give you a little information about how you can learn more about the things we've discussed over the last 5 or so months and figure out ways that you can partner with us moving forward if you want to delve into these a little bit more deeply. So first of all, Alicia, how are you doing this evening?
I am here. Hello. I mean, we're talking about grinding until you own it and strategies for a holistic approach to justice work. And when we talk about strategy, we're eventually going to get into some stuff around sustainability. And I think part of sustainability for me is honesty. And so I am here today. I am here. How are you, Ana Gelsi?
I am here too. Yes, before we started this session, Alicia and I had some one-on-one conversation and just talked about how we are quite tired, have a lot going on in our lives. And that's like you sort of mentioned, it's a beautiful example of why we have these conversations, because we're exhausted and we've got a myriad of things going on. And so what we've been talking about over the last 5 sessions has been, how do we do the work that we have to do in the midst of our lives and busyness and moves and engagements and illnesses and whatever it may be that make it really hard to do what we feel called to do. So it's kind of great that we are in the space that we are right now, because we're going to try and practice what we preach and give what we have and not demand more of one another. But Alicia, you used a really important word, which is the theme for this evening. We said that tonight was going to be about talking about grind until you own it, strategies for holistic approach to justice work. And within that, the 2 words that we have named so many times in the past have been accessibility and sustainability. And I believe you named sustainability.
I did.
I want to take a moment to talk about what we mean by accessibility and sustainability, and then jump a little bit into how those concepts apply to all the things we've talked about over the last 5 months. So first of all, accessibility. When it comes to a holistic approach to justice work, what do you mean by accessibility?
I mean, I think the root of that access is key for me. What does it mean to enter into this? Who can enter into this? What are the ways in which we remove barriers for people coming into the work? And so a lot of times I think when people in justice spaces, or at least that I've witnessed, talk about accessibility, it's, speaking about, ADA accessibility, right? Thinking about disabilities and how to make space for mobility assistance devices and what have you. But I think, accessibility can be stretched as a concept because we need to make things accessible for folks who are neurodivergent. We need to make things economically accessible. We need to make things, racially accessible. We need to make things accessible on every conceivable level of identity in order for people to understand that not only are you welcome in this space, we want to care for you in this space. And I think that that's what accessibility, or the possibility that accessibility holds for me. But I want to hear about your thoughts around this.
Well, you stole them all, so no, I agree wholeheartedly. The first thing that jumps to mind, as you mentioned, for most folks, is this idea of meeting ADA requirements, of being accessible for those that have disabilities. But for me, the first thing that comes to mind, because you often connect to different conversations based on the identities that you yourself carry, for me, what comes to mind is economic accessibility. And so I just think about my whole experience from, starting college when I was 17, becoming a Christian, being a part of college ministry, and doing mission trips, as problematic as they were. That's a different video series. And the feeling of guilt and shame and insecurity I had around needing to come up with $1,000, $1,500 to go on mission trips when I had no support system, no family, no resources, and everybody else was able to, send out a couple letters and it all came flying in. I felt this division from my community, my inability to access the opportunities that others were accessing. And then I think about getting into the kind of Christian nonprofit industrial complex sort of thing going on, where every other month is a conference, really every other week is a conference. And on the low end, not including lodging and travel, those conferences are, $150, $200. On the high end, I know a few, I'm not going to drop names this evening, that are $700, and justice is emblazoned across every banner, completely inaccessible, not just for 17-year-old on a gel seat, but honestly for 34-year-old, I better say 32, that's a lie, for 32-year-old on a gel seat. I'm still not in a place where I can access these things that are supposed to be about furthering our understanding and our capacity for justice, but they're not economically just. So I just said a mouthful, but that's because that's the first thing that comes to mind for me are the things that we're offering people for how they educate themselves, how they empower themselves, even accessible to those most in need of them. And I would argue that more often than not, they aren't. And our best show of trying to make them so is a few scholarships and very other little thinking otherwise, beyond that, for how we can make things more just, economically just. So yeah, I would name that and the many other things that you named. I think accessibility comes in terms of language and how we posture ourselves with what is woke or academic or activist vernacular, and you're in or you're out based on your knowledge of the lingo and dropping the right terms or the wrong terms. All these different things are issues of accessibility, and determining who's the in crowd, who's the out crowd. Why does it matter? Why does accessibility matter?
It matters because accessibility or lack thereof determines the community that'll help move X, Y, and Z forward. And so if we make spaces inaccessible, it means that there are people who aren't going to be a part of the conversation. If they're not a part of the conversation, and their perspectives and skills and histories and experiences can't be brought into that place to make it better, to make it more equitable. When we, don't prioritize accessibility for whatever population, right? Accessibility, like any other term, is not a coverall. It's you have to ask, accessible to whom? In the same ways when you talk about inclusion, you have to talk about inclusive of whom. I think, yeah. So, I think it's important for us to think through accessibility, because it's going to determine who is or isn't in the room, and then what shape this thing that we're working towards is going to take. Because those perspectives are the things that give things their shape. They really do.
Yeah, it's that constant asking of the question of who's in the room and who's not in the room, who's at the table and not at the table. And then going the next step, which is usually not the step that anyone takes, which is if they are in the room, if they are at the table, what is their access to power, to leadership, their ability to shape how the conversations in that space happen, let alone how the actions taken by the people in that space.
Absolutely.
So I think, it matters, because I think about examples, the last 5 years or so actually more than that now, in working in LGBTQ justice, and realizing that this community that was this justice space, movement space that was created around wanting to create access and equity for a marginalized group, seems to be dominated by those who, outside of their sexual and gender identities, otherwise hold a great deal of power and privilege in other areas. So they're usually able-bodied, they're usually citizens, they're usually white, they're often male. Honestly, they're usually cisgender. So even when we're talking about gender identity, so it's even in spaces that are otherwise very focused on justice work, there needs to be this constant conversation of who's at the table. Because an example we used to use for one of the organizations I worked with was, a third of the LGBTQ population are people of color. And so to have that conversation completely removed for how the work is done, that's an accessibility issue. So you have that accessibility. You get all these people in the room. You get them to the table. Sustainability. What does
Mhm.
that mean and what does that look like?
I mean, I think what it looks like is different, but I mean, ultimately, again, roots of words, right? Sustainability is to sustain. It's like, what does it mean when this thing is going to have some type of staying power? And staying power doesn't mean that it's stagnant. Let me just make a note of that now. I think a key point for me of sustainability and understandings of it are rooted in like adaptation, right? Like if something has the ability to continue to like move and be fluid and adjust and readjust to the presence of new populations, like as they are able to access a space, like that lends to the sustainability and the staying power of a thing. Like, what does it mean for it to continue to exist in some form or fashion?
I mean, the reality is we are so familiar with this cycling in and cycling out of people in the work that we do. And they're usually bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and really excited. Rose-colored glasses are worn by everyone in the beginning and want to give our all and die for the movement kind of mentality, whether that's a spiritual, physical, emotional death. Like there's a willingness to die for this. We're so committed. And so quickly burn out. And that's a sustainability problem.
Absolutely.
In ways. It's a sustainability problem. And so when we say sustainability, it's not, I think, particularly in nonprofit spaces, when that language comes up, you're talking about the funds. Do we have the money to do this another year? Is our budget being met? That's sustainability conversations. Maybe the conversation becomes, what's our turnover with staff at best? Rarely is that in a holistic, like how in terms of like healing and wellness of staff, and more about just like, are we retaining people and do we need to teach someone new? And so sustainability, I think, needs to be broadened beyond that and be talking about like why are people coming in so enthusiastic, so excited, and leaving disillusioned, leaving angry, leaving with trauma, physical and emotional and spiritual wounds. Why is this happening so regularly? And when we begin to have that conversation, one of two things I believe will happen. One, we would recognize that it's one thing we need to recognize is that needs to happen just for the sake of honoring who people are and recognize, taking care of them and valuing them for who they are. And then two, realizing that a lot of times the reason we don't get the traction we think we should be getting is because we're constantly having to start from zero. You get a little bit of progress and you got to start all over again because you've lost those people. And natural transitions in life are one thing, but constantly losing people because of that disillusionment and pain, that's a whole other conversation. That's a sustainability issue. So one of the things we wanted to do was talk a little bit about the conversations we've had in the past 4 sessions and some thoughts about accessibility and sustainability specific to those different conversations. Are you up for that?
Yep, I'm here for it.
So jumping right in, the first one, our first session together, we talked about, the theme was Thank You Next. And this was talking about movements, relationships within our own movement space. So how, for example, you and I both working on racial justice, our relationship to one another within that movement space. Can you give me some thoughts about, and this might be negative, or maybe that's the wrong language, but examples where things didn't live up to your hopes and expectations for accessibility and sustainability, and maybe examples of where they did, or where you saw opportunities for them to do so, and it either did or didn't happen?
Yeah. So let's see. Where didn't it happen? Oh, there are so many things I could say, and I'm trying not to name drop. Okay. So I have been in spaces, right? And I'm going to like make this as general as possible. I've been in spaces in which racial justice was a part of what they said that they were working towards. And people created programming that didn't in any way, shape, or form feel reflective of like what my needs were. like as a Black woman who comes from, you know, like the social context that I do, right? So like churchy, Black Baptist, but like it's been formed by other things around, you know, kind of the Christian ecumenical space. It's just really interesting, like, you know, so this is like a religious example. It's really interesting to be in like conference and festival spaces where people tell you, oh no, we're advocating for this thing, but they make assumptions about what it is that you need instead of asking you what you need. And I think that like when I think about accessibility and sustainability, whatever, and how it doesn't work, I think that that's the thing that doesn't work for me is people making assumptions about like what my needs are, because like that's the thing that'll make me not come back. It's like you don't take an interest in me as a person on the most basic of levels and ask like what my needs are, what my concerns are, what my thoughts are. Like those are the basic blocks I think of relationship building. And so I've now been in a place where I come to presume that if you're telling me that like, no, you are welcome here, and like, you know, then here are the things that are our priorities as it relates to justice, and you don't do those very baseline things with me, your intention is to like extract like my magic and like my perspectives and use them for your own gain, but not actually enter into relationship with me. And like, and that is going to limit the degrees to which I will help you be sustainable. Because like, I'm going to like take my presence away from these spaces. I've had to, in order for me to personally be able to pursue sustainability. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's like one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about something that doesn't work within intramusic spaces, is when people set the tone for me instead of, and not just me, but for others too, but they're not curious. Like it makes me wonder, like, you know, how it is that power functions in these spaces and like what their actual motivations are if they're not curious about what it is that I bring to the table by way of experience and desire and hopes, and even trauma. Yeah, so those are like my initial thoughts about that, because these places aren't genuinely accessible for me, because I'm not asked to actually bring myself. I'm just asked to bring my body, which I realize like is a whole other problem. You want me there for diversity's sake, for like these optics, but like, do you actually want me here? And I think the answer to that question is often no.
Yeah, I mean, you may not be name dropping, but I'm gonna go ahead and do a little bit. But for the purposes of making this real for people, because I think often naming things for what they are gets accused of being like, oh, that's just, you know, talking for the sake of talking. That's just, you know, chisme, wanting to gossip. But the reality is, like, this is why these things don't change. It's because they're protected. These conversations always happen behind closed doors and rather than publicly. But the one that's been happening right now, because the event just occurred, is Wild Goose, is the Wild Goose Festival. And so many of us, you know, you and myself included, have been past participants of Wild Goose. And there were some really good experiences within that for me, some of which is getting to be in spaces that are occupied by people I really respect, who have enriched like my spiritual and justice walk. But there's been a cost to that, namely for people of color and LGBTQ people within Wild Goose space. And that's not unique to Wild Goose. This is an example of something that's manifested in so many spaces where intention is not enough. And what you named happens. Many of us show up, many of us who are people of color showed up, being a small percentage, show up as teachers, as people from whom our gifts are being extracted. Come and speak, come and teach, come and run this area, this space. But when, you know, groups are brought together and letters are written and conversations are had behind closed doors about, we don't feel safe, and the response every time is, it is what it is. Sorry you feel that way. The message we get is, we want to extract what you have to offer, but the cost of caring for you is too high. There's a very clear message there. That those spaces, while we may be able to occupy them physically, does not mean they are accessible to us. And there's a distinction to be made there. And in spaces, at least for us, not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think on the flip side, like a positive that I could maybe offer of folks doing it well or trying to do it better. I was a part of, or was, depends on how you look at it, a part of the New Leaders Council, which is a national organization that works with people like looking to run for office or who are otherwise engaged in like in community. Anywho, one of the cool things to see, like these are all people who like rally around a progressive political ethic or ethos, right? What's been really neat to see is in the last few years where there were tensions before, right? They started asking people like what their needs were. And people, it started like actively trying to get people, at least within the Chicago chapter, who represented like, ideas that weren't previously represented necessarily. And so there have been shifts in like programming. So they're having a racial justice summit like in a couple of days. And when I look at like their intake forms, not intake forms, the registration forms for events, they've expanded and started asking questions around like pronouns that people use, and actually have one of the most robust. It's like really like beautiful to me is like someone who does like consulting work. It's one of the most robust forms I've ever seen as it relates to pronouns. I mean, there are at least 15 options like of pronoun configurations that they give, and it makes me so excited because their commitment to continuing to make this space increasingly accessible for participants in this program, at least on the local level, has reflected in change that takes seriously the concerns that were raised, and like it actually gives something like tangible, like the space is shifting because they're listening.
That's beautiful.
And so it's an encouragement to me to like see, and like, at some point when I am less broke, maybe they'll get my money.
Yeah.
But not now, because hashtag broke fire broke, we ain't got it. But I mean, we've definitely talked about like this whole intra-movement space, but honestly, I'd be really interested in hearing about like inter-movement spaces. Cause like, when we did that session, you can stand under my umbrella, sorry. We talked about inter-movement, like, right, what it meant for people in different types of movement spaces to, build relationships and what have you. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around accessibility and sustainability there.
Yeah. So the one that immediately comes to my mind is the often tumultuous relationship between mainstream read white feminism and women of color and racial justice work. So while obviously, you can occupy identities that are in both of those, or hold identities that occupy both those spaces, there's a clear rift between the movement work for those different, supposedly different communities. The myriad of accessibility issues there. I mean, this relationship between white feminism and feminists of color, women of color who are working for justice, this goes, I mean, first wave, second wave, third wave, like this is not a new argument. It's taken new shapes and new forms, really always meeting the same resistance. But it's this constant problem between these different movement spaces, these inter-movements. And it's the same thing that we're naming when it comes to intra-movement, where it's the same problem manifested in a new way or in a larger way, where we cannot get into those spaces. The reality is when it comes to mainstream feminism, where the political power, the social power, the resources, the funding exists, is in white feminism. That's who has the greatest access to those things. Once again, as is often the case, those of us outside of whiteness, those of us who are people of color, are doubly marginalized and have less access to all of those things that would help address the issues that we're dealing with. And so the accessibility issue comes again where we're simply not at the table, we're not having the conversation. And the clear example of how this becomes toxic that I can think of is we talked about this when we first had this conversation of you can stand under my umbrella, is that myth of scarcity and that language of divisiveness. So people of color, women of color, you're being divisive, you're angry, you're resistant, you're causing rifts between the community. This is already an uphill battle with men. How are we going to do this if you're causing problems between the women? First of all, the gender binary there, but again, another series. But it's this myth that the onus is on the women of color to deal with the rift between the two communities, when the reason we don't have that access in the first place is because of those who hold power, which in feminist spaces is whiteness, and like in most spaces. So there's that. And then that myth of scarcity again, of like, you'll get yours if and when we get ours, and there's something left over, which is just, it's not sustainable. You can't do work that way. You certainly can't build cross-movement partnerships that way.
Absolutely.
The reality is like, your conservatives and your Republicans of every shape and size and color are finding ways to work together and have each other's back. And like, at the end of the day, like, they're going to hold on to power at any cost. And if that means giving like a wink and a nod to things that they may not normally agree with, they're doing it. They're finding ways to do it. We're not. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of that, we simply do not hold enough power to do what we should be doing, because we're not finding ways to do that cross movement work. You look like you want to say something.
I do. Like, I'm really appreciating that you brought up this tension between women of color and white feminists, because of how old this problem is, right? Like, this isn't something that we just landed at. Like, I think about like what happened when we were talking about liberation, like at, the turn of the 20th century, right? Late 19th century, like, when there were opportunities for both, women's rights to vote and like that of persons of color. These things could have been done together if people had worked in tandem like 100+ years ago. But because, of folks prioritizing their needs over that of others, when I say folks, I mean white women prioritizing their needs over that of others, and like in throwing people of color, like, and specifically like Black persons under the bus, because like we weren't even like in the place where we had like a social discourse that was including Hispanic and Latinx folks and Asian folks. Like, I mean, there were, and Native folks, like there were atrocities actively happening to those populations where they weren't being brought into conversations in the same way that maybe some like Black abolitionists were back then. I mean, we could argue that the same is true now, where people are still being left out of spaces. But again, that's a whole other series. But all those things being said, it's like we're still in a place like where we're challenged by sustainability because of the ways in which people didn't get it right like 100+ years ago, and we're dealing with the same problems, maybe not in the same like shape and form, but like at the end of the day, we're still fighting for freedoms, and actually have seen a rollback of liberties that were on the table before, because folks weren't thinking about what it meant to like create opportunities for access for others who didn't share in the same power with them.
I'm muted. My apologies. The reality is we can technically occupy those spaces and still have erasure happening, which limits our access and limits our ability to sustain ourselves in the work. The examples that come to mind for me is the Me Too movement and Tarana Burke and all of her work. And then the reality is, when you ask people about the Me Too movement, the two names that come to mind are Alyssa Milano and Rose McGowan. And whatever fights are happening between those two camps. And Tarana's not even a part of the conversation half the time. And so I think of examples like that. Well, then while that may on the surface sound like, oh, well, what does it matter who gets the label? What does it matter who gets the billing? It matters when it comes to being able to sustain their work, making sure they're fed and they're housed and they're clothed and their mental health is being cared for. That is harder to do if nobody realizes they're doing the work. Nobody is funding it. Nobody is helping to sustain them. It matters that their names are known.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, not to, to stay on this too long, but like what you said just reminded me of Dee Barnes. So part of the reason why we're able to have conversations about Me Too and around like assault in, entertainment and like the public spheres is because of the journalist Dee Barnes. She, back in the 90s, was having these conversations and very clearly pointed out the ways in which not only other people were assaulted, but she had been assaulted by, like, I think it was Dr. Dre. She like honest about it and upfront about it and got blacklisted.
Yeah.
And it was just a few months ago, like, you know, as other people are starting to, like, you know, get some degrees of notoriety around their work, like in this movement, Dee was having a crowdfund to, like, because she was housing insecure.
Yeah.
She still, over 20 years after breaking the story of the abuses that women suffered, and that folks suffered, you know, at the hands of, like, these really prominent figures, still didn't have, like, a regular job. And so yeah, it's important that we name folks for their contributions and for what they give. And yeah, I just, like, thought of Dee and, like, and wanted to speak her name because, like, without her, like, doing that work back then, like 20 some odd years ago, we wouldn't be necessarily having some of the conversations around assault and famous folks as we are right now.
Well, not just name them and pay them. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think people like paying lip service to, like, oh, I know the name, you know, Tarana Burke. I know the name Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm like, well, have they seen any coin? Are they getting the gigs? Are they like all these different things? So it's not just name, but it's pay them, which takes us to the, you know, our third week that we had together, which was pay me what you owe me. So ideas around accessibility and sustainability when it comes to this pay me what you owe me. Do you have some examples of where it has or has not worked, or, you know, that thread of how do we get it from not working to working?
Yeah. So how it hasn't worked, like telling me that, telling me or telling anyone that they should do something for this term.
If you say exposure.
You're doing it for exposure. Exposure doesn't pay my rent, my bills, the various insurances that I have. It doesn't pay people's childcare. It doesn't put food in your mouth or satiate your hunger. Nah, exposure, like, that is not payment. It's not. And there are too many actors in too many different fields who do this, right? This isn't just an issue in nonprofits, but it's definitely an issue there. It isn't just an issue in religious spaces, but it's definitely an issue there. I mean, think of any conceivable field of work, whether they're dedicated to justice or not. Exposure is a thing that they utilize. I mean, I think about even internship programs that happen in corporate spaces. It's like, y'all got money coming out the wazoo and you trying to make these babies work for free. Like, and not even just making them work. And even if they pay them such a pittance, but, like, extract so much for them by way of their energy and their genius, and have the money to give. And even when you don't have the money to give, guess what? Like, one, there are certain asks that you shouldn't be making of people if you don't have the ability to compensate them in some form of fashion. And compensation isn't always monetary. Like, this is where bartering is a beautiful thing, because if you have services and or space or something else that person has need of, which you would know if you ask them. So going back to making the ask, but there are other things that you can give other than money that isn't just like this kind of like amorphous, like intangible exposure. Like, people will know, okay? No. That it just doesn't work. It doesn't. Because we name names, you know, and we've already named this entity. This is something that Wild Goose was, like, guilty of. I mean, there, you know, were very few people with that festival, like, who were actual contributors. It was a little bit different if you were a content curator, like, right? Like, if you were actually in charge of programming, those are folks who did get paid honorariums. And I can say that as someone who did receive payment because I was a space curator. But contributors, yeah, nah, like, folks weren't getting paid. And this is something, like, I think about, like, the talks that people give, you know, in their day-to-day lives. And for many people who are speakers or ministers, they rely on honorariums and rely on, like, their hourly rates in order to, like, to survive, because, like, this is their means of, like, of gaining income. Like, they share, like, what they know and their expertise as a part of a service that they give an entity. And, like, if you're paying them an exposure, then that means that, like, those hours that they've dedicated to, like, preparing this thing for you don't get given to something else that would actually adequately and fairly and justly compensate them. So it's a whole problem. But I think, when we're talking about access specifically and even sustainability, thinking about the methods through which we pay people is really important. And again, asking people is what's going to help you understand what works for them. One of my biggest peeves personally within workspaces right now is not being paid electronically, because I've had it be the case that I've had to borrow money from people in the past to pay bills when a check got lost in the mail or got lost in the chain of bureaucracy. Whereas electronic payment hits instantly, and I don't have to worry about check reissues because of X, Y, and Z person both in and out of a system bumbling, the handling of said check. I have many electronic means of payment. You could hit my bank account, my Venmo, my Patreon, my Cash App. Did I say PayPal already? I may or maybe I didn't. Whatever it is, there are all these modes of electronic payment that I have. And when my financial situation was a lot tighter than what it is right now, I've got a little bit of breathing room. Thank you, God. But when it wasn't the case, I would have to do things like borrow money from friends to pay my rent because of people not paying me in a timely fashion. And if you don't pay people in a timely fashion or in a means that they're telling you works for them, that's not really prioritizing equity, and it doesn't allow for sustainability for them. And sometimes that means if we're given the option on the top end, we won't access that space because we can't afford to.
I mean, I think to jump back to your example of internships, I was in a meeting this week where the conversation was whether the organization I was meeting with was going to be getting interns. And the suggestion was made, well, they can get school credit, et cetera. And I spoke up and I said, just as a, because this is a justice-oriented space, I was like, just as a reminder, in terms of being economically just and accessible, communities of color, folks who are impoverished or living, with low income are not going to be able to intern with you if you do that. And these are the people that you're saying you most want to have participate. It's an accessibility issue. It's a reason when you go to the Hill, all of the interns, you have to have money to be able to say, okay, I'd love to work for a few months for you for free. That's time I could be spending going and making actual money to feed myself. So yes, it is, in terms of getting a diverser group of people, I hate the word diverse, but getting that diverser group of people at your table, but you cannot get them. They have no access to that space if you don't pay them, and that includes internships. So it is an accessibility issue. So then that brings us to our final week we had together, which was...
Oh, I have one more thing to add on that. So I know that we've said a lot about economic accessibility, but I think it's a good thing to note that when economic accessibility isn't a priority, it means that other forms of accessibility aren't going to be able to be prioritized. Oftentimes, people experiencing marginalization are economically disenfranchised. So when we're speaking about people who have disabilities of varying sorts, when we're speaking about people of color, when we're speaking about sexual and gender minorities, the list goes on and on, folks, who don't have, their documentation, all of these different things are often tied to degrees of economic access. And so when that isn't a priority for your organization, your group, your entity, then it means these people aren't going to be able to enter into that space because you weren't thinking about what could serve as an impediment to their being there.
Right. Well, they get priced out of the thing that you say they are your audience, they are who you serve, and then you price them out, intentionally or not. So our final week that we had together before this one was talking about I'm powerful with a little bit of tender. It was our week about self and community care. And the question of what does accessibility and sustainability look like in terms of those things. So I don't want to rehash too much what we said during that final week together, but we talked about how, the capitalization, commodification of self-care, where it's all mani-pedis and taking yourself out on, treat yourself dates and all these different things. But I wanted to talk about what else we might be examples of where we've seen it done well, or where we've seen ways in which it could be done better when it comes to self and community care. And so one of the examples I immediately think of, when in nonprofits, in justice spaces in particular, is when it comes to hiring staff. And you named this earlier of you can't, if you can't pay people, then you can't be asking for those things. Well, that includes hiring staff. It includes employing people, whether they're contract or employee, whatever it may be, because people love to play with that they're a contractor game and then don't give them jack and like treat them so poorly. Um, but um, but when it comes to self and community care, one of the examples is adjusting the way we think about things, because so often in nonprofits we say like, what's the largest number of folks we can bring on board for the least amount of money? What's the cheapest health plan, if we offer anything at all, that we offer them? What's what's the least amount of vacation time we can give? Do we have to give maternity leave? Do we have to, or paternity leave? Do we have to do this or that? What can we get away with is the question, rather than what is looking at this with a spirit of abundance, and like, what is the most that we can give? What are the other ways we can cut corners in order to care for our people? And that's a form of community care that I so rarely see exercised when it comes to movement spaces. Is, can we get this job done with one less person? Can we cut our programming and focus on these 3 programs instead of those 4 programs, and only employ these 3 people rather than these 4 people? Not because the idea isn't cut a job and then overwork the remaining 3, but like, look at what's your actual capacity? Because I think we look at capacity of like, how can we take these people for everything they have to give until they're nothing left but a dry husk? And that means we had capacity to do that work, as opposed to what's the amount of work we can do where we still care for them. That's a form of community care that I haven't seen practice. Have you seen spaces where that is done well?
So kind of. I mean, I think that I can point to the vacation I'm about to go on as a positive extension of community care specifically. So I right now am rooted in Chicago, and there is a local organization that's formed over the last year called Sweet Rest. And their entire like desire for being is to give Black women doing justice work an opportunity to pause. And so I was approached maybe 8 months or so ago about, and they wanted me to consider taking a sabbatical. So they were willing to help me think about what I needed for an entire month's time, and then give me the resources to go do that. And I'm like, wait, what? You want me to do what? Now, it ends up just being because of some life transition stuff, I wasn't able to take the full month this year. And it's, but the community care in that was not only did they tell me that like that was okay and affirm the reasons why I said I wasn't able to take that, they pushed back and countered with, it's like, okay, even if you can't take a month, we still want you to have some degree of rest. And so you're going to take a week. We're going to give you the means to take a week. And so next week, I am doing something for me. So they told me to think about everything. And it actually was really beautiful so it was myself and actually another person who's the recipient of the award this year. And they're going to continue doing this. And I'll explain a little bit of how they actually get the funds to do this in a second, which is like brilliant. But they told us to like think about our sense of need. And they actually gave us like a worksheet that we had to do and think about all the things that were draining our energy, the things that gave us life and energy. And then like physically how we could orient ourselves to be able to actually be in a posture of like letting things go. And so like I had to like actually like do some degrees of like care and mindfulness, like an actual mindfulness, like being in my body. And what was super cool is that not only did they send me this worksheet that was helpful to help me in my processing, they also sent me this really, really nice smelling candle. It was like a milk and honey candle that that a local organization or artisan or whatever produced. And so like that added to the care. So I had to still myself, right? So it's like this kind of connection between self and community care. So even as they're providing community care to me, I'm having to engage in self-care to stop and hear myself long enough and what my needs are in order to respond to or be in a position to receive this community care. So all this said and done, I'm really excited because I'm going to Disneyland because that's what I decided that I'm going to do, because I'm a kid, I'm a big kid, and I've never been to Disney because, economic access of Disney is a whole other thing. But because of the generosity of these folks and the care that they wanted to extend to me, this thing I've been wanting to do all my life, I get to do, and I'm going to the Star Wars theme park. That was actually the reason why I went to Disneyland instead of Disney World, because it opens a little bit later in Disney World. But all that being said, you know, just the check-ins over the last, you know, several months, my latest headshots, because they wanted to also give me, the same people were connected to like another project that I work with. It's a newsletter for like white folks who are trying to just better understand issues of racial equity. They paid for our headshots and gave us stipends for like, you know, work that we were contributing to their platform. And that's the cool thing. Again, I told you I was going to tell you how this is funded. This is funded through people trying to actively work towards like racial justice and have the means to give. They've got fiscal resources. And so they're donating them to make sure that Black women who are in this work are able to like catch our breath. But yeah, I'm going to be, hanging out with Mickey Mouse as a form of community care. And so like, shout out to Sweet Rest for helping me enter into rest when they knew that I really needed it. And like, in pushing me to consider letting go, even though I wasn't able to let go for as long as they originally wanted me to do. So I think that that's probably the best example that I could give of community care, because it's coming at a time where I really do need it.
That's incredible. Yeah, I got an email this week inviting me to something with Auburn Seminary, which I think you're the one who put my name in the pot for that. So
you're going to?
So, but what really blew my mind, what blew my mind with the invitation was, because I've had invitations and things like that before, and then they're like, and the cost for this is, and like a real scary price tag is named. And they're like, that will include, you know, you'll need to get your flight and do this. And then no one thinks about how you got to feed yourself and all these different things. And so I've had to say like, oh, I love the opportunity, but no, thank you to so many different things. With this invitation included, we have the funding to make sure your lodging, your flights, your meals, and even a small stipend could be provided. So come and get like the continuing education and care that you need to do the work that you need to do. And here's how we can make sure it's completely accessible to you. And then I wrote and said, I really want to, but I have this other conflict that's going to make it hard for me to get there. We'll work with you. Let's figure this out. It was so caring that like, even if all the other, like, this is what's going to include hadn't been named, I'd already want to be a part of the space because of the thoughtfulness and realizing like, you are the people doing this work. We want to help you do it better or continue to do it. And we recognize that like, that might mean needing to cover the cost, needing to work with you and around what your needs and your schedule are. And that to me was a beautiful example of community care. So there are examples out there. I think we need to celebrate them because sometimes they're a little few and far between, but they do exist. And they give us a framework for doing it.
Exactly. Like these are strategies, right? Like taking care of things like people's vacations, right? It allows for them to engage in the work longer. Making sure that like you're taking care of like flights and lodging and whatever for like your speakers, you know, that helps them engage in the work longer and helps you further yourself in the work.
Yes.
You know, like all these things that we've mentioned. I mean, we've actually talked about a lot of things tonight. But they
talkers, we said we were going to keep it short.
We really did. Sorry, that was like a fib, but it was like a positive lie, right? Like sometimes lies can be positive.
Yes.
Oh, not really. Are bad. Okay. But that all being said, like, I mean, just think about, you know, what we've shared tonight, like go back over, like, and hear the strategies, because that's the thing, when we're sharing examples, we're sharing strategies that people have employed in order to make this work towards holistic justice more accessible and more sustainable, in order for us to be able to continue to keep at it and keep working for equity and liberation for varied populations.
So my final question, and we're going to try and keep it under a minute each so that we can go ahead and say good night. My final question is, in either of these areas, or whether it's a sweeping umbrella example, what's a first step? What is something in terms of beginning to build a strategy and a framework that you want to name for people to start prioritizing accessibility and sustainability in the way in which we do this work? Ask questions. Okay. Can you say a little bit more?
Yeah. ask people, like the people who you want to like bring into the space, ask them what their needs are, ask them what their vision is, ask them what their concerns are. That's a really big one. Because you'll find, you know, things that you need to avoid that other, you know, entities that they may have engaged with have, yeah, like that you may be able to avoid some of those missteps that other folks have committed. If you ask them what their needs are, you're able to provide for them, and then you don't create I don't know, like opportunities for people to like throw up the deuces because it wasn't a space that they needed. It's one thing if you're not able to like provide something, you can communicate that. But if you make assumptions that you know better than they do, like what they need and like what their cares are, and you don't meet it, it's like then people like down the line just aren't going to deal with you anymore. Like it's really that simple. And I think that that's maybe a thing for folks to keep in mind as it relates to justice. Look, we are in like a time and a space where folks do not have like extra energy to expend because we are constantly like at it. Like there are new things that pop up every day that are showing like challenges to people's like not even sense of liberty, but very liberties. Like the freedoms that they have are constantly being challenged. So nobody has time to like, you know, to waste with your bullshit. Like they don't. Like you have like one chance, maybe like, you know, 3 a year ago, there are some things you could have gotten away with. That's not the case anymore. Like you fuck up once, people are done.
Yeah.
And they're going to give their energy to people who show that they're serious about prioritizing them. So you may only have one shot.
I think my final statement of like what you could do to begin building a framework or strategy is to practice healthy transparency. And I think the word healthy is really important there. And what I mean by that is naming names when it is appropriate in order to protect and inform those coming behind you about what is and is not a safe or a healthy space for them. Healthy transparency looks like talking about who's getting paid what, and is it comparable to the person next to them, to their peers. Healthy transparency looks like talking about and creating space where people feel they can talk about what their needs are in terms of self and community care, how they're doing when it comes to their physical wellness, their mental health. Healthy transparency looks like talking about where we are dropping the ball, where we're failing, where we're not meeting, not living up to the mission and vision we've named, and what we can do to get closer to who we've said we want to be or who we are currently claiming to be. These are examples of practicing healthy transparency. And as we do that, when you practice that, not always, but often, I think we're going to find that there is a greater degree of grace as we're working through those growing pains, as we're making the changes to get better about being who we claim we want to be or are. If you tell me, hey, these are why our resources are limited. This is why this went down the way it went. This is how hard we tried, but still couldn't quite measure up to what we were hoping to do. I'm going to be much more inclined to be willing to work with you towards making it better the next time, rather than me just sitting there and being like, why the hell did that go down the way it went down? And why was I not taken care of? When you told me my voice mattered and my presence mattered, why did it not look like that was true? Healthy transparency will really mitigate that. We have to end here. This, as I said, is our final session. We're going to go into some off-camera conversation with our participants this evening. Before we do that, first of all, a huge thank you. And just I want to say how grateful Alicia and I for those that were a part of this conversation over the last 5 sessions and who are going to be a part of this conversation moving forward, whether that's the recorded series or having these conversations in person with us. We are so grateful. We were going to talk about this either way, whether you let us be on camera or not with you, because we want to talk about these things and we want to see these things happen. But we're really appreciative about the fact that there were others who wanted to do that with us. So I wanted to name that. And also just say, these are really complex conversations. And the idea behind these 5 sessions was not to be like, here is the beginning and end all. You know, this is the problem, the steps and the solution, and we've laid it all out for you clearly, but to say like, here's a small taste of what this conversation could look like. And our hope is that that taste is enjoyable enough that you'll want to continue it with us. And that is what you want to do. this is what Alicia and I do day in and day out. So if that means, via a webinar or a Zoom call or bringing us out for a retreat or speaking engagement or workshops, like we
also write. We're also writers.
Right. Well, I paint, Alicia cooks, so do I. I mean, it's all. But if you want to do these things with us, at the end of this video, you're going to see a streaming contact page that has our emails, our websites, and ways to get connected with us via social media so that we can keep having these conversations, so that we can make the work that we do more accessible, that we can make sure that it's sustainable, so that we are in it together for the long haul in a way where we are enjoying ourselves in the justice work. Not just like surviving it, but genuinely enjoying doing it together. That's the purpose of this. So thank you for joining us.
Seriously, thanks, y'all.
Yes. And hopefully we'll see you in person sometime soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.